Welcome back to the Conference Board. I'm Jim O'Hearn. I'm the Executive Director of Human Capital Programs here at the Conference Board. And today we've got a wonderful program on teams and how to build truly accountable teams. A key question for all of us in the HR community and across the business. And with us today is our guest. Alex Vincent is the Senior Vice President with Lee Hecht Harrison. Alex, welcome.
Thank you, Jim. Happy to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your role, Alex.
Right. So I'm in a global role. So I work on organizational development with larger clients who have a global footprint. And I also work with teams across the globe to help them get better, which is our topic for today.
Excellent. Excellent. Teams is a huge topic right now, and we're really looking forward to diving in. Let's take a look at an agenda for today. You're going to really take us back to some current state analysis on where we are, and it's kind of a sad reality of what we know about teams. You'll share some of the input from your Lee Hecht survey. We're going to talk about the difference between team clarity and commitment and what it means. Ultimately, you've got a call for action, but you've also got kind of a set of to-dos for many of us in the HR community, Alex, and we're looking forward to learning about them and putting them into practice. This should be very much of a how-to type of session in addition to how we got here and where we're going.
Correct.
For those of you joining us for credit on the program today, for HRCI or SHRM or CPE credits, number one, stay online with us for the entire program. You must be present to win. And the credit is available for the live webcast. Just specify which credits you're seeking for this particular program. In our session today, Alex, tell us about this. What's your view of where we're headed today?
Yeah. So today, really, we're gonna talk about and expose the journey that helped teams go from a current state, which is basically sort of average, to truly accountable with greater clarity and commitment. It's really the how to get there. So I think we'll also reveal some new insights and bust some myths into the fundamental building blocks that allow teams to become exceptional and to consistently exceed expectations and goals. And the intent is by the end of the session that everyone will come away with a clear sense of not only what it means to be an accountable team, but really how to get there, which is really the crux
what
of
we
it.
Can do about it.
Yes,
excellent,
exactly.
Excellent, perfect. All right. Let's start with let's get the audience involved. By the way, the chat box is open throughout. We welcome your participation. But let's look at this first poll. Teams are critical to the success of our organization. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, we'll see how close today's participants are to other data that we have. It'll be interesting.
Poll's open. Let's give it another 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Well, okay. That's pretty clear, Alex.
Yeah, complete consensus.
And what would you make of that? I mean, that's pretty consistent with what you know or what you've heard.
Correct. So on our actual live poll, 100% of the people who responded agreed with the statement that teams are critical to the success of their organization. So if we go to the data on the slide, if the control room could do that, we can actually show, we did a study a few years ago actually with the HR community, and we asked hundreds of respondents what they thought. And 92% of them viewed teams as critical to their organizational success. So very similar to what we heard earlier. And then we asked some of them, how many of them considered their teams to be truly effective? And only 23% found that teams and organizations were truly effective.
There's a scary follow-up question and quite a contrast.
Right. So more and more what we're seeing is there's a disconnect between what's expected of teams and where teams actually are. So organizations, just because of the context in which teams operate, they're under much more pressure. The contexts in which they work are much more complex, much more global. They're in networked situations. They're in matrixed organizations. There's a virtual component to it as well. And so organizations actually expect teams to function at a high level very, very quickly. So we bring people together, we give them a mission or a project to work on, and they need to function at a high level almost immediately. And the context is really challenging to actually get them to get there quickly.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what we're seeing in the data.
Yeah, and I would want to say, given some of these variables, you see teams doing some pretty good stuff on a global scale, virtual teams, et cetera. But we're very interested in learning more.
Yeah, exactly. So some teams are able to organically kind of get there, but even good teams can actually get better. So even good teams could become exceptional. So how can we help them accelerate the process? And how can we get the teams that maybe aren't so strong, get them to be even stronger? So that's really sort of the nub. But organizations are expecting a lot more from teams than they ever have. And I think they're actually collectively getting a lot less from teams than they ever have. So I think that's sort of the context.
Sad reality. Okay.
The other thing that I'd like to say is for years, and there's a recent study that was published in Harvard Business Review, we have not been able to find compelling evidence that motivational posters or team outings build great teams. Now, team outings where that's the only thing that is done, there really is no compelling evidence that that helps the team improve their performance. Now, as part of a mix of having teams get together and get to learn about each other can totally help. But what happens is organizations have tended to use, I would say, that strategy when teams aren't functioning well. Say, well, let's go to an offsite and let's kind of get together and do some other things to get better. It actually has very, very, very little impact.
Yeah.
And so what our point of view is that teams actually get together when they get together to work on the team, to actually work as a team on the mission that they have to to work on. So it's on the field of play that they get better and not in a restaurant somewhere or in a forest somewhere.
Yeah, and you've come up with some much more sophisticated ways that teams can work on their process.
Correct.
And we're very interested in learning more.
Correct. So really to dig into the team process. So just wanted to position this to say this also comes from sort of historically, organizations have spent time and energy on teams that are dysfunctional. So a little bit like in the individual coaching space, where if a leader was not functioning or was kind of dysfunctional, they would send them to coaching. Now, in the individual coaching, that's shifted. And so now it's for high potential people that organizations believe in. That shift has not happened yet on the team side. So they're still going to the offsite to fix things. And in fact, that may not help. And so I think that mindset and that sort of way of looking at teams that are dysfunctional and how to help them has not shifted yet from let's get them off site and let's get them to play together and that will fix the dysfunction. Seems not to be working.
But you are saying let's find some very good teams, continue to maximize their capability, and then they will be exemplars for others?
Correct.
Okay.
And actually help all the teams that are out there and not focus all of our attention on the dysfunctional one.
All right.
So our experience in working with teams, so I've been working with teams now for close to a decade, is that team issues are grounded in leadership issues. So too much focus on either team dynamic or team dysfunction, which I just mentioned. The key factor is leadership accountability and how to have every team member actually share the accountability of the team and not just the team leader. So that's a really different mindset. And our global research that we did on individual leadership reveals that only 45% of leaders are seen as being truly accountable. And so if leaders aren't accountable at an individual level, then teams won't be accountable at a collective level. It's going to be really hard for them to get there. And organizations continue to be challenged in leveraging the potential of teams. So I would say historically, organizations have always felt or always sensed there's great potential in teams. There's some great capacity that we can unleash. And every once in a while, you get that team that really stands out. But how can we do that for most of the teams? How can we get all the teams to get better? And how can we get those good teams to really become great teams? And then what we see is then the whole organization moves forward. But that's still a true and actual challenge for organizations.
Okay.
So our research that we carried out last year was really to explore the foundations of leadership accountability, clarity, and commitment as it currently exists in teams. So we had sort of our anecdotal perspective based on organizations and teams that we work with, but we wanted to quantify it and give it a bit more, of a research edge. So the study deployed a twofold data collection strategy that included an online survey and a set of semi-structured interviews with a select group of CHROs, so to get their sort of verbatim perspective. So the teams were rated in their organizations along 32 described behaviors. 16 statements assessed the clarity dimension, and 16 statements assessed the commitment dimension. We find that those dimensions are key for team accountability, which then leads to team performance.
Okay.
So we have a good cross-section, as we can see on the slide, of levels of respondents. So we had about 20% C-suite executive leaders who completed the survey, 24% vice president level, 34% director level senior managers, and then 23% middle managers. So a nice distribution
Yep.
of level of responses.
Right across the board.
So it gives us a good sample. And then we had 12 industries that were represented of various sizes from the U.S. market. So manufacturing, financial services, healthcare, professional services, and education. And again, a good distribution of size. So about 50% were below 1,000 employees, 29% between 1,000 and 5,000, 6% above 5,000 employees, and then 16% greater than 15,000 employees. So again, a nice distribution in our study.
Yeah. And your findings.
Well, the findings were, I think, surprising and compelling at the same time. So the overall findings that we find is organizations state that the majority of teams in their organizations are mediocre or weak. We kind of had the sense that that was the case, but we didn't actually know what the quantified value of that is. So we'll dig into that in a few minutes. High-performing companies have the most accountable teams. So this is really important, Jim, and to the folks on the WebEx, that it's not getting teams to be better so that they feel better or that they're happier. It's really about teams that do better actually contribute to organizations doing better. There's actually a very strong link. Mm-hmm. And so organizations get, and HR professionals get, that if they can understand, then the organization will do better. So they actually understand it.
Okay.
Team clarity and commitment are foundational dimensions that are significantly correlated to a very high degree. So this was a very sort of interesting and new finding, and I'll dig into that in a bit. And then we've identified the key building blocks for clarity and commitment. So we actually have a how-to step-by-step on both clarity and commitment that HR professionals can apply to actually help teams get better.
You know, this is fascinating. I know you're going to go further into the definition of clarity and commitment. We're going to go farther with that. But just looking at these findings, Alex, what are some of the to-dos that or early recommendations that come up for you for HR organizations? And what do we do in light of this? Where do you start to focus?
That's a really good question. And so I think organizations and HR professionals have to actually understand that, and do understand it. About moving. Not only do we want teams to go from a 5 out of 10 to a 7 out of 10 just for sort of our professional mandate's sake, but we know that if we get most teams that are at 5 to a 7 out of 10, the organizational actually increase. So there's actually a recipe that will work for most of the teams. The good news. So applying the process and sort of the building blocks that I'm going to point to and actually can help organizations get those things.
The other thing I know you're going to ask us is that a lot is going to be done internally. So you don't necessarily be an expert.
Correct.
But you're going to be
correct. Absolutely, and I think that's one of the sort of main intents that I had in sharing the results. Is this is really a how-to that a lot of which can be done internally by HR professionals or internal OD professionals. So cool. That's where we're coming from.
Cool. So shall we move into a high-level definition of clarity and commitment?
Yeah, so team clarity, the way that we think about it, or the way that we've defined it, refers to the degree to which all team members or each team member are clear on their business context. So actually what's happening outside in their industry or in their business context, really important. The trends in the external environment and the industry dynamics. Again, that's outside the organization. Then the strategy of the team and the expectations of the key stakeholders. What's really interesting about Clarity and what's important is that it's a combination or a hybrid of external things that team members need to look at and internal things that team members need to look at. So it's not enough to just look inside the organization.
Yeah.
They actually have to look outside.
Yeah.
And that's where, research and data and
Right.
things like that can really, really help.
Yeah.
Team commitment refers to the degree to which team members are fully committed to the mandate or the mission of the team. So each team gets a mission, and we need to understand and we need to pay attention to, are all team members fully in to that team mission? That's the first thing. The second thing is, are they clear on how they will execute the team's priorities? So in other words, what will the team deliver no matter what? What are the 2-3 key things that they will focus on no matter what happens? Working with other teams across the organization actually helps commitment as well. So in other words, to interact where those offsites may not work because they're not as direct and they may not be timely. So that's sort of the link between the two.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if we should check in with our viewers and see how they might define their organization. Control room, shall we pull up another poll? We've got 2 questions here. One, my team is highly effective. I agree or disagree? Wow, we're already seeing some
some trends. Yeah. Interesting.
Responses still coming in for 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's close it up. 50 to 49?
So we basically have a 50-50 split.
Wow. Yeah.
So they feel that the team, so half of the respondents feel that the team that they're on is highly effective, and half feel that their team is not highly effective. So really interesting.
Interesting. Well, we got plenty to talk about there. We've got one more question.
Sort of a back-to-back situation here.
Yeah. So how about this one? Most teams in my organization are weak, mediocre, or exceptional.
So this one will be interesting to see how closely it fits to the data that we will dig into in a bit.
A lot of responses. Let's give it 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And unfortunately, it looks like a lot of mediocrity, which is consistent with the sad tale of affairs we referred to earlier.
So this is really, really close to the data that I'm going to show in a few minutes. So 5% of the respondents say that the teams in their organizations are weak. 11% or almost 12% say that most teams in their organizations are exceptional. So almost sort of the same number, but a little more on the exceptional side, which is good. 83% actually say that most teams in their organizations are mediocre.
Mediocrity.
Yeah, mediocrity rules the day, unfortunately, on the team side in organizations. So we can go now back to the slides, and we can start showing what our data show. Again, very, very similar to what we've just seen in all the polls that we've run. And so what we found is that the majority of teams and organizations are mediocre or weak. So very similar. 80% of teams are mediocre or weak. That's what our study shows. In fact, 10% were classified as weak. 70% were classified as mediocre. So very similar to what we saw in the poll. And then we have 16% is good, and 1% is truly accountable. And then we have 2% is driven, and 1% is supportive. But what we see is that really most of the teams and organizations are sort of middle of the road. They're like a 5 out of 10, and we've got 80% of them that are around that space.
Wow.
Very few. So the good news is very few are dysfunctional. So very few are terrible,
Okay,
terrible.
okay.
So that's actually good news
Gee.
because we didn't know
The other
what
part
that
of it
number
was pretty scary.
that number would be.
Glad to hear that.
And then the other sort of not good news is that most teams aren't great or exceptional. The good news is, so the good news in this, most teams are kind of average or kind of mediocre. The good news is that with those teams, with a little bit of effort, a little bit of focus, a little bit of work, they can go from middle of the road to good without too much effort and without too much time. Whereas you could spend way more time, way more energy, and way more focus working on weak teams or dysfunctional teams, and they couldn't even get to mediocrity. And so what we're saying is the vast majority of teams are actually able to improve with very focused effort without too much time and too much energy. So that's the good news. We can actually get most of the teams to move.
I think you really got our attention. That's fascinating, and I'm glad we've got another half hour to talk about how.
Yeah, and that's really the key, right?
Yeah,
How do we help teams get there? And so really sort of the one thing I also want to point out is we talked about this earlier, but the fact that high performing companies have the most accountable teams, we actually have a very, very sort of clear pattern here of relationships. So the poor performing companies actually have teams that are lower than average. The average performing companies are kind of right in the middle there. They have their teams being mostly average. And then the industry leading companies actually have the teams that do better. And so in fact, if we can get, so if the majority of teams are at a 5 out of 10, and we can move the majority, so if an organization can move most of those teams from a 5 to a 7, there's a direct relationship to how well the organization will do. So there is a bottom line impact to getting teams to improve.
Yep.
So that's the good news.
Okay.
So the good news is if we work on teams and the HR community, if they're able to identify those key teams, so that's where that role becomes really important, to identify those key teams to work on. So if a lot of teams are average, there are a few key teams that actually can have a large impact on other teams and on where the organization is going. So if you can identify and start working with those key teams, then you can move the organization forward.
I'm thinking, Alex, intuitively this makes enormous sense. But interestingly, we've spent a lot of time in the last 10, 15 years focusing on leadership development.
Yes.
Your whole focus
Yes.
has been on leadership
Correct.
development. And this conversation is very focused on teams.
Yes.
And so you're kind of shifting the dynamic.
Yes.
And we need to refocus. We'll keep our energies around effective leadership
Yes.
development and particularly high potentials and how we can help that audience.
Absolutely.
But you're pointing to enormous opportunity for us in HR and the OD community and the leadership development community working with teams.
And what's really interesting on that point, Jim, is just recently we've had a global organization reach out to us where proactively, as they read through our study and read through some of the findings that, I'll go into details in a few minutes, they said, oh, we've actually got a new business unit. We're actually putting a new team to head this new business this unit together.
Yeah. How do we do it?
Yeah, how do we help them hit the ground running?
Yeah.
And so now they're starting to think about the things that I'm going to expose in the next few minutes.
That.
Correct.
If I
Correct.
shut up and let you do your thing.
Totally.
Okay.
Totally fine. So just overall, so this is the distribution of everybody that responded to our survey. So truly accountable teams, so the ones that are in that top right dark green corner, build a high level of clarity and commitment, which then drives commitment. And then the rare teams that are high on both are truly accountable and perform better. So clarity is a key driver of commitment. So there's actually a nice relationship between clarity and commitment. You can actually increase commitment by working on clarity, and we'll go into the details of what those things are. Clarity actually drives 65% of commitment. So we've actually quantified it, and it's actually a much larger number. So we kind of knew intuitively again, or organically we knew, or through experience, that clarity drove commitment, but it drives it to a really, really high degree. The other thing that implies is that commitment is not an inherent trait of team members. People don't come in fully committed. In fact, we need to help them raise their commitment And that low clarity will decrease the level of commitment. And the more clarity we can give them, the more that the commitment will go up. And so that's partially a team leader role, but it's also a big part of the organization's role to provide as much clarity as they can to their teams. So if teams are at a 5 out of 10, it could be because they don't have the full clarity that they need. And that if we work on that, which is actually pretty straightforward, I would say, based on the research that we've done, if you work on clarity, you can actually have a big impact on commitment, and you can actually move the team very quickly because it's a 2-for-1 leveraging process here.
I want to ask more questions on clarity, but I know that's where you're going.
That's where I'm going. Okay.
Let's do that.
So the things that came out highest on the clarity dimension is that team members are clear on the needs of external customers and consumers. That's the number one. So what do we need our team members and our team leaders to be clear on is what do the external customers and consumers expect from that team? So that's the number one thing that they need. The number two is team members are clear on the collective goals and priorities of the team. So they understand what the team is going after. Relatively straightforward. Team members are clear on the primary obligation of the team in driving the success of the organization. So how close does their work and their priorities help the organization do better? They need to see that link very, very clearly. Team members are clear on what matters to their key stakeholders. So they understand what the primary stakeholders are expecting of them. Again, much clarity, much work that we can do on that dimension. And then team members are clear on the trends and drivers in the external business environment and industry. So again, a combination of external things and internal things. So some of these things the team can get on their own, but other things they need to get from the organization or from other sources in order to get complete clarity.
Now, there are some nuances here. You're really understanding your customers and your consumers and their expectations.
Yes.
And really understanding the primary obligation of the team relative to the organization.
Yes.
And then your key stakeholders. You might know your boss, but what about
you? But
if you were to point to one of these that might really have an impact, I mean, and they are prioritized, but where do you have an example of a best practice in someone really using clarity to drive performance?
Yeah, so I think the one thing was really about clear on the primary obligation of the team. So one of the executive teams that I worked with, their obligation was to help the organization grow and fulfill its shareholder value and growth numbers. What happened was a couple of members of the executive team did not play their role to that level. So they were going in, this was a technical organization, so they would go into the technical weeds and not fulfilling the obligation of the executive team as opposed to a project team. So only when we were able to have a conversation with the executive team members to actually talk about, well, your role is actually to drive the company forward, not to get into the technical details of programming or software or technology. Exactly. So when they started to shift that, when they started to actually pay more attention to the primary obligation of the team, that's when the organization started to grow.
Yeah.
Again, impact of the team performing better. Yeah. In that case, an executive team, the link is pretty straightforward to get the organization to perform better.
Yeah, specific to clarity.
To clarity and clarity on the obligation of the team. And that's a piece that the team completely owns.
Yeah. I know we're going into commitment.
Yeah, and commitment, again, really interesting, this first one.
That?
Yeah, and the first one is really interesting, or the number one. Team members are passionate about the future of their organization. So everybody who's listening and watching, the most important thing that you can do to drive commitment on teams in your organizations is to paint for team members on your teams a positive future for your organization. That is the number one driver of commitment. So if I'm on a team, and I am on a team as part of my organization, the thing that's going to impact my commitment the most, at least in terms of our study, is that my organization is able to paint a positive future vision for all of us. Here's where we're going. Here's why it's important. Here's how we're going to succeed. Here's what success looks like, is the number one driver of commitment.
You're saying the organization is doing that. Is the team doing that as well? Is the team driving that, clear, positive
Oh, yeah.
passionate view.
Yeah,
The
so the-
team is carrying the ball with
Yes,
passion,
correct.
consistent with the rest of the organization.
That. Yes, correct. And in order for me to fully commit to my team's mission, I need to understand that this team's mission is worthwhile in the broader picture. So the broader picture is sort of like the start,
Yeah.
and then, okay, here's how my team mission fits in,
We
right?
got a key role
Correct.
in all this. Yeah.
And the second thing is that team members deeply care about each other. So they need to actually care about each other as human beings. So I need to care about you as a colleague, and I need to care about you as a person. So this goes to, there's been a lot of research done recently around psychological safety.
Yeah.
So there is more psychological safety when people care about each other. So this is a direct link between the psychological safety and the caring about each other.
Wow.
And this is really where, we can talk about it in terms of trust, we can talk about it in terms of psychological safety, but it's actually the number 2 thing that drives commitment, is that I need to care about you, and I need to know that you care about me as a teammate.
That's fascinating that you're making that link to psychological safety. Come on back for another show. A lot of discussion around here, particularly in high-risk kinds of organizations, hospitals, construction companies, the fire department.
Yes.
Where building a culture of psychological safety, where I really care about you, that we're going into a situation that ain't easy, and guess what? It didn't go quite the way we thought it was going to, but we're safe together, and I got your back.
Yeah, and I know 100% that you have my back, and you know 100% that I have your back, no matter what. That's massive. Yes.
Topic of interest.
Yes, I would agree. Team members then are able to set high standards of performance for the team. So here's what's really interesting. So for me to get more commitment is I need to know that I'm on a team that wants to win, and I'm on a team that wants to do well. I'm on a team that wants to do better. That's really interesting. Again, kind of we know that, but again, we're putting it as the top 3 here. Team members demonstrate strong accountability for executing the organization's strategic priorities. So I know what my team's mission is, but I'm also aware of how I'll help the organization succeed, which can be really, really important. And then team members demonstrate resilience and resolve in the face of adversity. So we're able to bounce back from setbacks, we're able to keep going, challenges don't prevent these teams from doing well, so they're able to just keep going despite the challenges. I'll go back to the challenges: matrixed, virtual, global, high standards, short time frames. The teams that are fully committed are able to go through all of those challenges and out the other side. So I think these are really compelling. Again, a little bit of myth busting, I would say. There's some things in here which are new, and some things which are confirming what we're seeing out there in other research and other spaces.
Interesting question, Alex, from the chat box. Noel is asking us, are you noticing anything different with virtual teams? I mean, these principles of clarity and commitment make a lot of sense. Are the challenges more complex in a virtual situation?
Yeah, I think so. In the virtual space, what's really interesting is that some teams actually figure out, even in the virtual reality or in the virtual space, they actually pay much more attention to clarity, because they know as soon as there's like a little bit of gap in clarity, when it's a virtual context, that gap becomes very, very large because of technology, because of time, because of space. And so in fact, the teams that do better pay much more focus on clarity in that space, the teams that do better. The teams that don't pay attention to it as much, the virtual space actually pulls the clarity away.
It's going to make it worse.
Right, and what that does is indirectly, which is I think the virtual teams need to realize, indirectly pulling commitment away. So clarity goes down, then commitment goes down, then you've got a double whammy of a virtual team, not totally clear, not totally committed, out in nature, and we're not sure what they're doing.
Before you know it.
Yes,
and
exactly.
We're back to mediocrity.
Really, yes, right. Yeah. So really important question that was posed.
So looking at your list of commitments, going back to the if there was one thing that a CHRO or an HR leader might consider to drive commitment.
Yeah, so the 2 things that I would focus on, because to me they're kind of equivalent, although they're on different dimensions. One is that team members deeply care about each other. So we want to make sure that actually, we get the sense, and that's where HR professionals can really get a good sense of, okay, where are these folks on this team in terms of them caring about each other, about having each other's back. They usually have a good sense of that. So seeing, where the teams are, and then that team members set high standards of performance for the team. So as soon as you start to see teams that they're not satisfied with being at 7 out of 10. They're not satisfied with being at 8 out of 10. They want to continue to improve. Again, when you have those two things, you've got a lot of key things to drive commitment on that team. So those would be the two things that are easily, I think, accessible, that we could see relatively readily, and that could give us a good sense of where the team might be on commitment.
So follow-up question.
Sure.
I recognize on this team that, they get along well and they've got each other's back, or they don't.
Yeah.
How do I improve on that?
Oh yeah, so we'll talk about how to increase commitment,
we're gonna go into
and how to increase
how
clarity.
to intervene.
I think the one thing is to actually get a sense from the team members, right? So I can have my assessment, and even as an external coach, I can have kind of my assessment, or I can hear, because typically we'll talk with the HR professionals up front to say, well, Alex, we're not sure about how this team is doing, or what's really standing in the way. So we actually do a diagnostic. So it's really important for either the HR person or myself to do a diagnostic to say, well, is what we're seeing with the naked eye actually what's going on? So let's do a diagnostic, which is basically a survey of the team members.
Yep.
And we actually interviewed the team members as well. So if they all say we don't really feel we have each other's back, or there's a couple of people on the team that don't have each other's back, or there's a couple of team members that actually don't have each other's back, well, no, in fact, undermine other team members. So quick story.
Oh man.
Had a team, this was a financial team, where they were functioning relatively well in terms of their performance, but not only did they not have each other's back, they actually competed against each other. So the competition was on the team. And so when we pointed that out to them, so I did the diagnosis, and when we pointed that out to them, they said, yeah, we compete against each other because that's how we've been promoted. So at least they were honest about the assessment. And so then what we proposed with the team leader was to say, okay, how about you guys start to collaborate and let's see what happens to your performance? Are you willing to share resources? Are you willing to share information? Are you willing to work on client files together? Are you willing to do these things as a unit as opposed to individual contributors?
Doesn't sound so bad.
Right. And they said, well, we're willing to give it a try, but you had to realize that these people grew up in a hyper-competitive financial context. So it was actually going going counter to their DNA.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense.
So they committed to it and they did the work. And so then following working with them, over a 6-month period, working with them and them doing a lot of this collaborative work, their performance went from 90%, and this is on numerical financial KPIs, they went from 90% to 130% performance.
Wow.
Really by just focusing on these things, caring about each other, working with each other, executing the organization's priorities, and collaborating, which they had never really thought about before.
Wow.
So again, a few key things.
Yeah.
A lot of this can be done internally.
Yeah.
Getting the diagnosis, though, is really important. So not just what we're hearing,
Yeah.
but let's go validate it.
Yeah. Fascinating. Your role, a little bit of diagnostic, a little bit of identifying what's going on, helping them do a self-assessment on,
Correct.
on, in fact, how we are collaborating and
Correct.
operating,
Correct.
and then making some tweaks. But I know you're going to go further into what else might we do? How else might HR intervene in these situations?
Nice. So the key building blocks of clarity to drive accountable teams. So this is really where we get into the how-to. So what are the 5 key things to focus on? And again, HR professionals can do this, internal OD professionals can do this, or external coaches can do this as well. So clear on the collective goals and priorities of the team. So the team members need to be absolutely crystal clear on what the collective goals are and what the collective priorities are. Normally, team members are clear on what their individual goals are or what their individual priorities are, and are not so clear on what are the collective goals. What are we driving towards together? Why are we put together as a team? It's because we have to hit a collective goal. So that's the number 1. Number 2, understand how the team's mission aligns to the organizational strategic priorities. So it's not just a special project or a busy work project. They completely understand how their mission aligns to the organization's strategy. And that is 100% clear to all the team members, not just the team leader. The third, and these are in order of importance, so they're going from the most important to the 5th most important. Clear on changes and issues impacting their organization. So again, this is that external lens. What's happening outside the organization's walls that could impact the organization that we need to be aware of, so that maybe we need to adjust how we do things or how we operate. So they always need to keep those external antennas sharp.
Raises a question. How does the team do that with organizational trends?
Yes. So they can do that with other teams in the organizations and also their collaborators or stakeholders in the industry that they are in. Most organizations will work with other organizations either on a contract basis or on a JV basis or a whole bunch of different structures. Mm-hmm. So that can help bring a lot of intel to the table. But again, you can't have your head down and just worry about your team and say that's going to be enough. You need to have your head up and say what's going on outside of the team, what's going on outside of the organization that we need to be aware of, that we need to pay attention to.
Interesting.
An important dimension there. Clear on the kind of leadership culture the team needs to succeed. They actually need to articulate and define. Do we need a democratic style? Do we need more of a, we're just gonna drive to the result? Do we need to build consensus? So what's the leadership culture that they want and that they feel they need? So they need to define it. They need to define it and operationalize it. Again, this can be done with help from HR professionals, OD professionals, to really say, well, what's the type of leadership that you guys really need to thrive?
Well, just for grins, how are you defining leadership culture? We're talking decision making?
Yes.
We're talking
roles and accountabilities. We can talk about decision making. We can also talk about who's going to play what role on the team based on whatever particular issue is coming up. So, for example, who's going to be the critical analyzer or play devil's advocate? How are we going to challenge each other? How are we going to work together? All those things, we want them to actually be explicit about how they will operate as a team.
And again, we've probably got leadership cultural components as we walk down the hall on, posters for the larger organization.
Correct.
But we never talk about, well, how are the six of us going to operationalize those things in here?
Exactly.
What's important from those in here? So we got a definition on the bigger wall.
So again, it's the team working on itself helps the team get better. It's the team members working on itself.
Wow.
And then the last one, clear on how to align their work across the broader organization. So how do they align their piece to others? And then if we go to commitment, I'll just keep going. Again, we talked about this earlier, are passionate about the future of the organization. That's the number one driver of commitment. Number two, demonstrate strong accountability for executing the organization's strategic priorities. So I have to be all in as a team member to where the organization is going. I need to be all into the strategy. I need to understand it. And I need to fully buy into it. And that's true of all my teammates as well. Number three, support each other's development as leaders. So how do I help my team members get better? If you think about the sports metaphor, how do I help my colleagues get better as athletes? How do I get my colleagues get better as leaders? Help each other out, give each other honest feedback, have the dialogue. You could do better on this one, Jim, or you really did great on that one, Jim. How are we going to help you do more of that?
Or I'm working on this. Keep an eye out for me, Alex. How did I do? Give me some feedback after the 2:00.
That needs to happen on the team between team members, not just the team leader giving feedback. That's sort of the default. I'll go to the team leader, ask the team leader for feedback, or the team leader says, well, I'm going to be the only one giving feedback. The team leader tends not to be in the trenches with the team members. If we're in the trenches together, you are the best person to give me feedback, and I am the best person to give you feedback.
Yeah.
And if we don't do that, we won't get better as individual team members, and we won't get better as a team. This is, again, hits a whole bunch of things on feedback and courage and having honest dialogue. Again, psychological safety will contribute to this. The absence of it will actually hinder this. So again, these are all linked to other things that we're seeing. Find ways to break down silos and drive collaboration across the organization. Teams that are allowed to collaborate, teams that are able to collaborate, it actually drives up commitment. So it doesn't just make things work better, actually drives up commitment as well. And then hold each other accountable and call out unproductive leadership behavior, which goes to support each other's development as leaders. So there's two key things here on feedback that actually contribute to a very strong degree to commitment. So these are the building blocks, both on the clarity dimension and on the commitment dimension. These are the how-tos, and I invite the HR professionals, the OD professionals that are listening and watching to actually key in on these, because these are the key things. So ROI. A couple of these will have a large impact. So you don't have to do 30 things. You don't have to look at 50 things. There's 5 key things on clarity, 5 key things on commitment that will actually help teams move forward.
Again, a reminder, the chat box is open. Let us know questions that you may have for Alex. And to this point, it's just staying with building blocks for a minute.
Yes.
A couple of success stories. Where have you seen organizations really move the ball? HR teams move the ball through some version of an intervention to drive clarity and commitment.
Yeah. So there's one example again with a financial organization where the IT department of this financial organization, the leader of that team said, my team operates at a 5 out of 10. So basically what we've talked about for the past several minutes. And then it was finding out what was it that was leading to the 5 out of 10. So going back to a little bit of a diagnostic, right? And so the team members knew that it was actually one team member, a key team member, that was actually holding the team back. And so really, it wasn't about a team intervention. It was about HR working with the team leader to remove that dysfunctional player from the team. And that's really, work. So I did the diagnostic, but the leader of the team knew that this was the case. HR knew that this was the case. I was just like the third confirming, validating person to say, yes, this is the case, and doing a team intervention won't actually help this team. You actually need to intervene on the one individual that's damaging the clarity and the commitment of the team members.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so they did that on their own, and then the team started to perform very quickly.
Interesting. Yeah. Let's stick with it. Other examples. You've seen a bunch of this, Alex. What else might resonate with you, stand out as a best practice in a role that HR played in helping the team's performance?
Yeah, and I think the other role that HR can play is really identifying if there is dysfunction on a team. So if there is dysfunction on a team, where people are not really playing well together, or there's a player like this example that's not really contributing to the team, either on the clarity side or on the commitment side, to not let that, because sometimes the HR people are the ones who talk to employees, talk to people who interact with the team or the team members. They're usually the early warning system. And so then to either work with the team leader or to work with other functions or other HR business partners to help that team, or to reach out for help, either proactively, externally or internally. I'd say don't wait. And so a lot of times when HR has reached out to us, it's sometimes it's gone too far down the road, where then the only solution is to disband the team, because the team became so dysfunctional because HR knew about it for months and months and months. They talked about it, but they let it go on. There wasn't much to do.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting question from Catherine's kind of got the key question here around the leader.
Yes.
What about when it's the leader who is not contributing to clarity and commitment?
Yeah, so that's a really good and challenging question. So if for example the HR business people and then the leaders or even the team members, if we do a diagnostic or we do interviews, they all point to the team leader, then doing a team intervention would probably counterproductive. Because all the team members would be in this intervention and saying, well, why are you having us do all this work? Well, it's really associated with the one person who's leading this team. Then I think the focus and the intervention needs to be on the team leader. Now, there could be a couple of things. Is the team leader self-aware of how they're contributing to the lack of clarity or the lack of commitment of the team? So this is where you go more into an individual coaching perspective, and you see, well, is there room to work with this leader? And then it would be a two-pronged strategy. It would be working with that team leader, assuming their self-awareness, assuming they're willing to do the work on themselves to help them get better. Then it's working with that leader and the team. So we don't let the team off the hook. If the leader's willing to do the work, if they're willing to introspect and say there's stuff that I need to do on behalf of this team, then we start with the leader, but then we bring in the team and work with all of them. Because the big key is the team leader, although in the way that I conceive of the teams that we've been talking about, the team leader does not sit in a higher chair. They're not sitting on a throne, right? They're sitting at the same table as their team members. Now, their chair might be different, but they're no different. They're also a team member in that team. Now, they're playing a bit of a dual role. So they do have more influence than other team members. But at the same time, they still have to be part of the team and work with the team members to make the team better, and let the other team members take some of the team accountability, so it's not all on the team leader.
Yeah.
So there are things to do at the individual level, but we shouldn't neglect what there is to do at the team level. Now, clearly, if you have a dysfunctional leader, and there's all kinds of HR professionals would know, is this leader, are we able to turn this leader around to help the team? If not, then I would say you know what to do better than anybody else.
Well, and this is where our efforts complement one another. We've got coaching going on for some leaders. We've got leadership programs going on for others. We've got all kinds of assessments that are being used.
Correct.
But you've been here talking with us about teams, and it's fascinating to just focus on teams and what we can do to drive their capabilities.
Yeah, exactly. And so some of the quotes from our CHROs that we interviewed. I think there is a confidence that comes from being able to take ownership of team results, transcends being primarily concerned about their own outcomes to help others. I think that collaborating or feeling that sense of ownership of a team or group outcome is how teams can contribute to the larger enterprise success. So this was CHROs citing our study without having seen our study, because our study hadn't been published yet. They were literally pointing to what we've talked about. When you set individual goals and try to hold teams accountable, there is a disconnect. Again, organizations know a lot of the stuff that we've talked about intuitively. And then the more emotionally connected you get, the more accountable you become to the team. Psychological safety, trusting each other, having each other's back. Again, they're pointing to all the results before we had the results out there. So the HR professionals, the CHROs, they know this. Now what we've done is we've quantified it, and we've given them and us a way to help teams get better. Good news is most teams can get better, good teams can get great, and there are a few key things to focus on to make that happen.
Wow. Shout out to my old buddy, Dave Goods. All right, Dave, thanks for the comments. Interesting question here from Anthea saying, what about the diverse and cross-cultural implications of clarity and commitment?
Oh, yeah.
Do you see styles and biases adding more complexity to this?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, right? Because I've worked with a lot of teams that are very diverse in terms of backgrounds, in terms of cultures, in terms of where they are in regions on the globe. And what it does is you actually have to consider other things in terms of clarity. You need to make sure that even with the diverse perspectives, even with the diverse backgrounds, all of the stuff that we talked about in terms of clarity will work with those teams. Now, you probably need to do things in a more deliberate, in a more systematic way, but those 5 key things will help those teams as well, or those team members as well. And once you do that, I find there's no difference in terms of commitment. That the commitment actually is because different parts or different cultures on the team don't have what they need to be clear. But once they're clear, they're as committed as anybody else. So good question. At the same time, the building blocks that we've pointed to do help those very diverse teams as well.
That's a great point. Very similar, but you just have to maybe underscore a little bit more cross-culturally at times.
Yeah, pay attention.
Another maybe final question, but Joyce is saying this makes a lot of sense in professional environments. She's contrasting those a little bit with a manufacturing type of environment. In the more heavily operational types of environments, are there any distinctions or differences in driving clarity and commitment?
That's a really good question. So I think a lot of the sort of initial team research, or the initial, I would say, models of team actually came from the manufacturing environment. So the self-directed work teams and all that. So I think that a lot of the stuff that has come out in this more recent study, I think can apply to those teams as well. Because what we're doing is we're holding the team accountable. That team is accountable for its mission. Whether whether the mission is putting things together or driving, financial or doing marketing or whatever it is, the team needs to own their mission and needs to understand how their mission fits into the bigger picture. I think there are nuances and things to consider because the context is different. But I think, again, clarity and commitment will work in that context as well. There might be some things that will be more clear. There might be some things that might be less clear. How does their piece fit into the strategy? How does their piece fit into their key stakeholders, or is just manufacturing these things to a certain degree and off they go? So something to think about. Really good question again. Really good comment.
yeah. Makes you think about the important role of the supervisor and some of the team leads.
Yes, correct. In those contexts. And so,
Great stuff.
Just to kind of summarize, what our study reveals is the majority of teams are mediocre a week. So lots of work for all of us to do, and there isn't a moment to wait. Organizations with stronger teams perform better. So improve your teams, you'll improve your organizational performance. There's a direct link. And with organizations and teams doing the work, enhancing clarity and commitment, teams can move from mediocre to exceptional, and teams can move from good to great. So this works with mediocre teams, works with good teams, and works with high-performing teams. They can continue to get better, again, by continuing to work on clarity, continuing to come together, continuing to really help each other get better. So I would say there's that. And then we've identified the key building blocks that enhance clarity and commitment, separating the truly accountable teams, which then leads to high performance, from mediocrity. And then the call to action to everybody who's on the webinar: read our ebook, Accountable Teams and Extraordinary Performance, that you can find very easily off our website. There is the survey in the ebook for you to actually assess your team. So this is where HR professionals, OD professionals, you can go in, use the survey questions that we use, and actually assess the team that you're on or other key teams in the organizations, and work with your team or other teams to improve clarity and commitment to help them and help your team become truly accountable. Because it's not just good for the team members, it's also good for the organization.
Absolutely fascinating. Wonderful. Wonderful. Alex, thank you so much. Really nice to have a focus on teams for a while. And thank you for the background of your research, what you learned. Very interesting to see the correlation between our audience and the research. You gave us some great suggestions around how to drive this in your organization, and you've given us some very good how-to suggestions. There's some simplicity and some elegance in what we can do to make this happen. Great stuff.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank you for inviting me to talk about this stuff that I deeply care about.
Thank you so much. A couple of updates on things going on around the conference board. We've got our Performance Management Conference coming up right here in New York, November 13th and 14th. An excellent overview of some of the key trends in performance management. Come on over, or consider sending a teammate to come over and join us for performance management. Also, in March of this year, the 19th annual Talent Management Conference here in New York. March 26th and 7th, the 16th annual Executive Coaching Conference, where there are always some wonderful leaders. A few from Lee Hecht,
nice. Good to hear.
From time to time, that have really played a role there. And April in New York and June in San Diego for the 25th annual Leadership Development Conference. Wonderful opportunities to hear from thought leading, best practice practitioners, existing practitioners in organizations in key roles that will be happy to share their story on things that are coming up. Related research, a publication out this year on the Global Leadership Forecast and key insights for driving your people strategy, the DNA of engagement, part of an entire series on engagement. These are moments that matter throughout the employee life cycle. We've got webcasts on the Global Leadership Forecast, and also one on November 15, 16 on innovative solutions for value-based talent development. On behalf of all of us here at the Conference Board and the team at Lee Hecht Harrison, it's really a pleasure to have had you with us today. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you, and until next time, I'm Jim O'Hearn. Thanks for joining us here at the Conference Board.